I am Linda Maris. I serve as president of the National Christian Foundation here in Milwaukee, and I am here to share with you a God story from my life. So what's a God story? It's those times in your life that may seem impractical, impossible, sometimes the words fluke, coincidence, or even divine intervention or miracle. So regardless of where a God moment ends on the spectrum, it's always meaningful and sometimes it's life-changing. I'm going to start my story in 1995. It's 25 years ago, and I'm going to start it with Superman. Superman was the superhero of the day. Christopher Reeves was a very popular actor, and he starred in 4 Superman movies. He was tall, dark, and handsome, strong. People really loved him. And unfortunately, he had an accident in 1995 that changed his life. He was thrown off of a horse and fractured his neck. So what happened is his vertebrae up on the top, C1 and C2 were fractured. It injured his spinal cord, and he was paralyzed from that point down. So what happens with the spinal cord is when it's injured, the brain can't send messages to the rest of the body. He ended up a quadriplegic, and he couldn't use his hands and his legs, and it even impacted his breathing. So take you a year later, 1996, and my life was good. I can say my life was really blessed. I met my husband Charlie in law school. We graduated together and got married 3 months after that. We had successful law practices, and we're able to have children very easily. We've had 3 children in 4.5 years. Not sure whose idea that was. Pretty quick, but at the time in 1996, they were 4, 7, and 9. We had just bought a house in a new neighborhood, a nice house that was big enough to raise 3 children. And I was a minivan driving mom. So December 13th, 1996 was a Friday the 13th, and it was just before Christmas. I headed out in my minivan, and the plan was to go downtown for a Christmas luncheon. And I got about 2 blocks from the house, and there was a 4-way intersection, and I stopped at the intersection. And I saw a car starting to come down a hill, and I thought, okay, they're back a ways, I'm fine. And I entered the intersection, and before I knew it, I was T-boned. So the 2 fortunate things about that is I was not hit straight on, and my children were not in the car. So I did a 360, I ended up in the ditch, and honestly, the first thing that came to my mind was, this cannot be happening. It's Christmas. I don't have time to deal with a whiplash injury. I was taken to Frederick Hospital, and they took x-rays, and I remember being on the table, and out of the corner of my eye, saw them starting to scurry about. And I was later told that I had fractured my C1 and C2 vertebrae in my neck. And for 2 days, the doctors kept asking me to move my hands and my feet, and they were kind of baffled why I didn't have spinal cord damage. What I found out later is God has blessed me with an abnormally large spinal column so that when there was movement in my vertebrae, it didn't impact my spinal cord. So what they did was, I had a spinal fusion. They took bone from my hip and they put it at the C1, C2 area. And what's amazing is those bone chips knew how to grow and they knew how to stop growing. So that fused that area of my neck, and they sent me home in something called a Minerva cast. So it was a hard plastic cast that went up my body and around my head, and it immobilized my head. Unfortunately, I didn't have to have that halo that you've seen sometimes where they drill into your skull. It kind of freaks me out when I think about it. So I had this Minerva cast. I was in it for almost 6 months. During that time, I had no rotation in my neck. My muscles atrophied, and by the time I took it off, my neck was pretty small, didn't have much muscle. I couldn't drive for 8 months, and I was realizing this morning that it was my first experience with quarantining at home, so to say. And so that gave me practice for a couple other times in my life where I had to do that. Moving then to September of that year, so about 9 months after the accident, I was starting to feel pain and nerve issues down my right side. And I went into my neurosurgeon, and we were having issues with C3. And he wanted to operate again, and I hadn't even recovered from the first surgery. And so we just took it easy and took a wait and see approach. I went back in December. It was almost to the day of a year anniversary of my accident, and the nerve pain, or the pain in my arm, was gone. And I said, something's different, something's changed. And he said, well, this is a pretty rare thing, but your body auto-fused. So the bone knew to grow to that next level, and then it knew how to stop. And so since that time, I've been fused from C1 to C3. I don't have a lot of rotation in my neck. I sometimes pivot with my hips, so that's why, if you see me doing that. And I was followed by the neurosurgeon for 10 years. He really thought I would need more surgery, but I've had no issues other than muscular issues, and no bone spurs or anything of that nature. C4 has been stable, and it was just really a God blessing in my life. What I do want to talk to you about, though, is really the miracle that happened in my spiritual life, because I think that's even more significant and probably has more eternal consequences. So on December 13th, I'm in the hospital. Things were happening pretty fast, and I'm being transported up to my room. And I remember looking up, and above it said spinal cord trauma unit. And I think the transport man must have kind of seen a horror on my face, because I'm like, why am I being brought to the spinal cord trauma unit? And he was a tall, bald, big man with a deep voice. And what he told me was, you know, honey, for most people, Friday the 13th they think is a bad day. For you, it's the best day of your life, because most people don't walk out of this unit, and you're going to walk out of this unit. So I really feel that God was using this person to bring a message to me, change my whole perspective. It gave me a thought process of gratitude. It's, you know, I could have died in this accident. I'm here for a reason, and it was this overwhelming rush of grace in my life that just changed my life. So two lessons that I've learned from them. One is life purpose. After the accident, I really set out on a course of, why am I here? You know, you have a life-threatening accident and you start questioning things. So if you remember, I was practicing law at the time, and for some people law is a calling. For my husband it is, but for me it was more of a career path. So I set down a long path of trying to figure this out. And at the time there were not a lot of resources in that area. I read the book of Ecclesiastes and The Purpose-Driven Life, which were great, but they talk about more what our purpose is as Christians, you know, to glorify God and to know God. Today there are a lot of resources out there to help people find their personal purpose, how we're created, and why we're here, how God wants to use us in our life. So that was really important. The other really important lesson for me was Romans 8:28, which says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So let's break that down a little bit. First part, and we know. You know, this is kind of, you know what you know what you know. It's so embedded in you, it's in your soul, but it's also in your head. It's something that we know in our head, because both biblically and scientifically, we know that our thoughts control our feelings, which control our actions. And so if we know this in our head and bad things happen, the first place I can go to is, well, I know God's going to work on this, like work for the good of this. Second part is that for those who love God. So for those who love God, know God, trust him. We have to trust God with this, because sometimes we don't always have the answer. All things work together for good. So the good, the bad, the ugly, the messy, the valleys, the mountains. You know, life is messy. Sometimes we don't know how the good and the bad are going to work together, but he works those together for good. And then lastly, and this is really important, is for those who are called according to his purpose. Sometimes we can get so much about my life, myself, my career, what am I here for, my purpose, and we play a part in his grand purpose, which, when you think about it, is so amazing. We're these little bits of sand here on earth, and he uses us and uses us for his purpose. So I'm going to illustrate this with one story that comes out of Matthew. And it's not a parable, it's a story. And there were two men who were demon-possessed. And Jesus calls out the demons and casts them into a herd of pigs. And the pigs run down the hill, they drown in the lake. The two men are saved, they run to town, and they tell everybody about Jesus, and Jesus is glorified. But think about it from a different perspective. Think about this from the perspective of the pig farmer. Now, what's the pig farmer thinking? Is he thinking, Jesus, what are you doing here? You're ruining my livelihood. You're sending all my pigs in to drown in a lake. Or is he thinking about, my goodness, you used me to save two people and to glorify you for eternity, and this is a story that's been told for thousands and thousands of years. So I'm going to leave you with one thing. Here's a poem that most people know called the Tapestry poem, but it's incorrectly labeled and incorrectly attributed to Corrie ten Boom. It's really, the poem is really entitled The Weaver, and it was written by Grant Colfax Tuller. He was an American minister, composer, and songwriter, hymn writer, and it's over 100 years old. This was written in the 1800s. My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colors. He weaveth steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in a weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. He knows, he cares, he loves, nothing this truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice to him. Thank you.